Hi everybody, and welcome to one of my videos. I know that Michael has been putting out quite a few, and so I thought I would do something that I totally love and am into, which is all about mummies. I was very fortunate when I was in my younger years. I had been a Middle Eastern dancer for about 30 years. And in my wonderful career, I was able to meet some amazing Egyptologists. Two, actually, came to Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was part of a chapter where they actually had Egyptologists come in and give lectures, and it was called ARCE, the American Research Center in Egypt. But they would come to different states and have different Egyptologists come in and talk, and I got to meet quite a few amazing Egyptologists. I got to meet Kara Cooney, and you've probably seen her on the History Channel, Travel Channel. She's had her own show. And then Bob Breyer, I think he was called Mr. Mummy. And then these two, which is where I got all my information for mummies, is, and I know that you've heard this name, Salima Akram, and then Aidan Dotson. And they did a fantastic book called The Mummy in Ancient Egypt. And this is the book right here. I'm trying to get it to where it doesn't glare. And this is the book I've had with me for quite a while, and I actually won it in a drawing, and they autographed it. So I feel very privileged to have this book. But what I did is I took information that they gave all about the different aspects of mummies and the afterlife. I shortened it quite a bit because obviously, as you can see how thick this book is. And I just decided to do two parts so that you guys can kind of get a better understanding of the mummification process, but also because I didn't want the video to be too long. So I'm going to be reading off of what I had written here. But I'm pretty excited about today because Egypt is a great love for me. I have felt very at home there. So this is something that I've been wanting to do for quite a while. And so here we go. So I call this The Truth Behind Mummification and the Afterlife. And the thing about mummies is that we always look at it from the aspect of, they're like kind of like zombies. Well, the ancient Egyptians had a different view of the afterlife, and they truly believed that the afterlife was something where you were young and revitalized again. And an ancient Egyptian funerary text states, "You live again, you revive always, you have become young again. You are young again and forever." And that's how they kind of view the afterlife. It wasn't so much that they wanted to be young here, where we have a lot of people who, and I don't have anything against plastic surgery, believe me, I don't. There's a lot of people here who want to stay young while they're alive here. And the Egyptians were so different. They wanted to be young in the afterlife. They thought, well, hey, I'm getting older here, but I'm going to be young after I die. And so I want to make preparations for that. So they made preparations and they did a lot of different things to enjoy death, life after death. And I love the way that they view it and they look at it. So let's get going on what I have here. And I think you might find it interesting. The earliest surviving Egyptian burial graves date back to the period before 3000 BC, before the foundation of the Egyptian state. The dead person's body was considered the link to the reality of their existence and here on earth. The sustenance of the body was considered an offering that was used in magical spells inscribed on the walls of the tomb or chapel. From this thought process came the idea to preserve the body from degenerating and decomposition, which led to the elaborate process of mummification. But if for any reason the body was damaged, which I find this really interesting, it was possible for its role to be taken over by a sculpted image or likeness. If this wasn't available, it was believed that saying the deceased person's name could be enough to maintain his or her eternal salvation. Which makes sense because in the burial process, even in today's day and age. I remember being in Mexico where I was sitting watching over this old cowboy's coffin, and the family would say his name quite often, quite a bit. And I think it was to make sure he wasn't forgotten, but I think it was also to help guide him to where he needed to go. The ties in with the Egyptian belief that to speak a person's name was to make them live, which means remembering them in this life was a guarantee that they would survive an existence eternal. Tombs ideally comprised two elements, the below-ground burial chamber and the above-ground offering place. Priests, employed priests, family, and friends would gather in the above-ground offering place of the deceased, leaving food, nutrients, and converse with the departed on feast days. The burial place was centered on the body itself, with a shrine containing a false door that symbolized the two worlds through which the spirit could emerge and return at will. And that reminds me a lot of the Day of the Dead that they celebrate in Mexico, and we celebrate in New Mexico. So there's a lot of connections, I think, from old traditions and ways that are still kept alive today. Egyptian funerary ceremonies were long and complicated. The prepared mummy would be retrieved from the embalmers and taken in procession to the tomb. The procession included priests, the mourning family, and friends. If the deceased were wealthy, professional mourners would tear their clothes, beat their breasts, and pour ash upon their heads, wailing at the same time. So you could have a whole group of people who are like theatrical actors and actresses who would come in and mourn your death along with your family. Part of the burial was opening the mouth in which the dead body was reanimated using tools that were used during birth. The Pesach kef knife was the key item used, which consisted of a flint blade that broadened to a fork at the end. Also included were two sets of small vessels. Once the mummy was reanimated, it joined the mourners for the last time for a funerary feast. Having feasted, the corpse was placed in the tomb with much pomp and stance, all the while with the deceased starting on their journey to their afterlife. This entailed overcoming the obstacles placed in its way by the guardians of the various gates that lay between it and its goal, known as the Hall of Judgment. Aid in doing so was provided by the Book of the Dead, which was a guidebook supplied with spells to negate the threats that lay between them and their resurrection. And so I find it really interesting that the Egyptians used the word resurrection quite a bit when they prepared the corpse, the dead body, in the funeral, in the details of it. I often wonder how old verbiage, how it's reused also in religion. I'm not saying that the resurrection word was, it seems like it was more of a remembrance when it comes to religion, especially with Christ, his resurrection. But the Egyptians used it before that. So I find it interesting how we take things from certain places and then we just continue it on. And I kind of like that. The gods and goddesses of death. Osiris was regarded as the model mummy. Myth had it that he had been murdered and later dismembered by his brother Seth. The body was ultimately rescued and reassembled by Isis, his wife. Isis, embalmed by the jackal-headed god Anubis, and resurrected to become ruler and judge of the dead. So his wife, Isis, embalmed him by creating the jackal-headed god Anubis. And Osiris is always represented as a wrapped mummy, his arms crossed at the breast. So if you see him, he's going to be something kind of like that. So here he is. So he has the head of a jackal. At various times during his let's see if I can even read my own writing, posthumous ordeal, Osiris was watched over by his devoted sisters and his sister was Isis. Just remember they intermarried each other. And Nephthys. These two goddesses are pervasive in funerary representations and from the Middle Kingdom, guard the foot and head of coffins and sarcophagi. Two other goddesses, Neith and Selker, regularly join them in the safeguarding duties along with four beings known as the four sons of Horus, named Emseti, Happy, Duamataf, and Quebesenef. They are linked with the eternal organs removed during mummification. The spiritual part of the dead person was believed to have a number of aspects, including Ka, the Ba, the Ankh, and the shadow as well. Of these, the Ba was depicted as a human-headed bird, which was the form for the spirit to travel within and beyond the vicinity of the tomb. The concept of the Ankh was more esoteric, being the aspect of the dead in which he or she was not dead, having been transformed into a living being. The Ka was more complex, being an aspect of the person being created at the same time as a body and surviving as its companion. So I think it was surviving it being dead, but yet surviving as its companion. So it was kind of alive and dead at the same time, which is interesting. It was the part of the deceased that was the immediate recipient of the offerings. The Ka is shown as an upraised pair of arms. So now let's go into the wrappings. The Egyptian word for mummy is wit. Another word, when kit, means mummy cloth. Wrappings of the bodies held great symbolism. Through the embalming process, the body became a holy image. A priest would read specific spells for each part of the body to protect and reanimate them in the afterlife. The bandaging process was considered one of the most magically powerful moments in the process of mummification. Most bandages were reused clothes or linen sheets, which makes sense because I was always wondering where they got the bandages, and obviously it made sense. It would be their old clothes. And why wouldn't they use their clothes? Because if they're going to need their clothes in the afterlife, they would wrap them up in their clothes and in the sheets. So I know it might make sense to you guys, but I think about a lot of things, and even though I have these books, I haven't read them in a long time, and so it's just like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So it makes sense, and I love the way that the Egyptians just reused things. It was wonderful. So wrappings, especially produced for mummies, only began to appear from the late 18th dynasty onwards. The earliest wrappings were goat skins, which I did not remember. The Middle Kingdom burial saw an increase in the amount of linen used. The 19th dynasty saw the introduction of polychrome textiles used as shrouds. In the 21st dynasty, shrouds decorated with black and red ink drawings of Osiris also had accompanying text, protective text with them, and they became a standard part of the wrappings. In the 26th dynasty, wrapping patterns became more elaborate, with bodies wrapped in narrow bandages wound in complex patterns. From the Middle Kingdom, masks remained in use for 1,000 years, with varying styles used. The front of certain masks were lengthened downwards to provide a covering for the front torso and the legs. While most Middle Kingdom masks are broadly similar, wearing the archaic tripartite wig, many stylistic variants are found. As time passed, better modeled faces' ears became common. Some were gilded and or inlay, but most were painted faces, frequently with yellow ochre for both males and females. Ladies' masks sometimes incorporated breasts and normally showed a broad collar around the neck. Various other ornaments were occasionally represented, including the regular false beards. So, what I did here, excuse me for getting out of the picture, is I have this amazing book. And we all know King Tut. We know he had some of the best masks ever. And so I just lost my page here, but I wanted to show you, think about things like this when you look at the masks, because that's what they used. So it's dependent on which dynasty, if they painted or when they used gold. But this is King Tut's mask. And it did go over the shoulders and down the front, from what I remember. So I thought that was very interesting. The interment of King Hor of the 13th dynasty included what seems to be a separate mask of very thinly carved wood, overlaid with plaster and gold foil. Some of the rare masks of the 13th to the early 18th dynasties also incorporated avian plumage. Early ones having headdresses that are entirely feathered. And see, this is something that I actually, quite frankly, forgot all about, or maybe I didn't even read it. I had no idea. So they were just, everything was just elaborate, and everything was just beautifully done. You know, and I think that, you know, when it comes to my time, I might change a few things and have something a little bit more elaborately done, because I think I like that. I think it's so cool to embrace death and just say, hey, it's like having a party and inviting death over and just celebrating the life of the person, and just not hiding from it. Because I think we've come into a society where we have so many scary movies where we always look at death as the Grim Reaper. But I love the fact that the Egyptians just like they weren't afraid of death. They just kind of saw that death was a part of life. And it wasn't like they put a neon sign out saying, hey, we're over here, but they didn't hide from death, and I really like that. Mummy boards continued to be used into the reign of Osorkon the First, the 22nd dynasty, as closely resembling contemporary coffin lids. Radical changes took place in regards to funerary assemblages, most strikingly in the adornment of the wrapped mummy. The body was entirely enveloped in a rigid carnage casing, richly decorated with mythological vignettes. Royal burials also adopted carnages with the same basic divine images, but sometimes in gold foil rather than paint, and with the striking difference of a falcon's head in place of a human one. This may reflect the king's identification with Horus and another funerary god, Sokar. Looking back over the history of Egyptian mummy adornment, the recurring theme is the attempt to portray the features of the underlying person on the exterior. It seems as if the shroud was used as a ground for funerary text and vignettes. In doing so, the mummy and the anthropoid coffin converged in both form and adornment. So, the conclusions I came to with this was that we always hear about the shroud that was placed over Jesus, but the Egyptians used shrouds as well, and they used to put interesting spells and little text in there to protect the mummy and to protect the person in the afterlife, to help them escape any ill will or any evildoers in the afterlife. So I kind of like that. But I also think, too, one thing that I learned from this is that they spent a lot of their life understanding that death was going to eventually come, and they made preparations for it, but they didn't stop living life. They did what we do every day. They woke up, they had life with their families, and they went on. But they didn't make death the end, which is what I think I love the most. So next, let's look at what they would put in. Let's look at the amulets, jewelry, and other ornaments that they would use when they would decorate and place the mummies in their coffins, and when they would say goodbye, and what they would do in the afterlife. So take care, stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video.